Let's try to understand what was Nadav and Avihu's alleged crime, or why did divine uh, justice come down on them so harshly? Who wants to offer an answer? Well, the sages say a few things. I guess they're trying to look for reasons. But what's the pshat? What did they do immediately? The proximal reason for what happened to them. Hold on, I think we have a message coming down. Nobody to see it. Uh, what did Nadav and Avihu do to warrant such an extreme and deadly punishment? Let's move back a parsha. I have here Parshas Pekudei. In Parshas Pekudei, we have almost a chorus. What is the chorus? Anybody know? As the Lord commanded Moses. Look at this. I'm going to put this on the screen. Once they had completed building the tabernacle, God actually approved of it. Why? Because they did exactly as God said. Here we have Pekudei. Kol asher tzivah Hashem Moshe. He did. Uri ben Hur and Bezalel ben Uri ben Hur and Achisamach did everything here as it says, as God commanded Moses. Kol asher tzivah Hashem Moshe. Then over here, we have the chorus. Kasher tzivah Hashem et Moshe. Using the different types of wool that they had, red, blue, and purple wool, they made the garments for Aaron, as God commanded Moses. Next place. Over here, they made the priest's breastplate and his apron, also out of this fancy material, just as God commanded Moses. You see how many times it's going to occur here. Over here, they also made the engraved stones, gemstones, just as God commanded Moses. Over here, skip a few, they also attached the gemstones and all the different parts of the Kohen's, once again, fancy apron, just as God commanded Moses. Over here, they attached the bells, the pomegranates, to the hems or the non-hems of the Kohen Gadol's vestments, just as God commanded Moses. Down here also, just as God commanded Moses. This is getting kind of repetitive. Over here, once again, they tied the tzitz to the right way on the turban, as God commanded Moses. And they complete all the work, just as God commanded Moses. And then it's going to get kind of crazy. Over here, once again, just as God commanded Moses, that's what the children of Israel did. And once again, Moses blessed them. Why? Because they did kasher tzivah Hashem kenasu. Let's go farther. Vayas Moshe. Moshe did when God commanded him to set up the tabernacle, just as God commanded him. He spread the tent of meeting upon the walls of the structure, just as God commanded Moses. He brought the Ark of the Covenant into it, just as God commanded Moses. He set the bread on the table, just as God commanded Moses. Over here, he raised up the candles, means he lit them, just as God commanded. So too, with setting up the altar of the burnt offering. And you see it over here, setting up the kior, so that the Kohanim could wash their hands and feet. Okay? And that brings us to the very end, and then they did it. So it's about 20-something times at the end of Pekudei where they start actually keeping all the mitzvahs. That is the theme of a tabernacle. Why? Because we get into Vayikra over here. They set up the tabernacle. The cloud came down, dwelled upon the tabernacle. It says the cloud was always there, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. And then our book of Leviticus opens with what statement? That God called to Moses. Right? He calls to him from within the tent of meeting and told him how to make sacrifice. The point of sacrifice is that it should be a reach miholah, which is literally a nice smell, a pleasing aroma or fragrant odor for God. And Unclus classically translate this not literally, or at least less, and also less anthropomorphically, that it is a sacrifice that is received with favor before God. Because reach miholah is too literal. Okay. Even though we saw there's halach nafkamina, you have to make sure that the pieces of meat that are put on the altar actually are nice and raw before doing so that they actually roast on that fire and have the smell of roasting. If you were to pre-roast or pre-cook your meat and then put it on the altar, it wouldn't satisfy this reach miholah criteria, right? So here, Rashi explains the point of sacrifice is when God gets reach nichoach from all the sacrifices. What is it? Rashi didn't make this up. This is what Chazal said. It's God is saying He's getting a nachis, Yiddish nachis, He's shepping nachas ruach, from what? From His will being done. And this is the way I wanted it. Do we have that with any other mitzvah, by the way? That the mitzvah is considered received with favor because we did it the way God wanted to? The only other mitzvah I think that's received with favor is having to do with prayer and shofar blowing. Okay? God receives prayer. He receives it with prayer because God wants the heart, dedication of the mind, sacrifice of oneself. But it doesn't say because you prayed exactly the way God wanted you to. As a matter of fact, God did not ordain a formula for the prayers. The sages had to do that about 1,000 years after Moses. It used to be prayer was strictly from the heart. It was sincere. It was highly personal. That's what God really wants. So the sacrifice is kind of interesting. It has to be done just as God wants. That's the running theme of which parsha? This parsha, Vayikra. Everything is Reach Nicholach. There are many times you go through it yourself, and you can see that. And that's what we pick up in the next parsha, Tzav. By the way, there's no natural line in the text between Vayikra and Tzav. The book of Leviticus, Vayikra, is one, and there's various sections. The first section is the laws of the sacrifices, and that basically culminates in what you and I call Parashat Tzav. And then it's a little bit more of a narrative. We left off in the story with the construction of the tabernacle, and now we're going to get to how the priests were initiated into the service. That's what we're going to read this week. And after that story and the aftermath, we're going to get into the section regarding kashrus. And after kashrus, tumas tahara, and more specifically, tumas haguf. After that, we're going to talk about achremos and kedoshim, the Yom Kippur service, the reason for centralized sacrifice, the moral code, and then kedoshim, various other mitzvahs, and more moral code, and then bahar b'chukosai, which is apparently a retcon. At least here's what happened on Mount Sinai, by the way, as part of the covenant between God and Israel on one side, as represented by Moses. How you have to keep the Shemitah year and everything that's all its related mitzvahs, and what's going to be if you don't keep it. So that's the structure of the book. Now, obviously there is a connection. Why were these narratives put next to each other? But for now, let's focus on what's in Parashat Tzav. Parashat Tzav continues with, do the korbanos exactly as God said, and that will be received with favor. Good. Now let's watch what happened. That's the first half of Tzav. The second half of Tzav is kind of interesting. Let's search within the document these keywords, Tzadi Vav, the shorish of command. And what do we get? Now, look at this. Command Aaron, okay. Here's Reach Nichoach, by the way, again. Let's get into this part of the story. Okay? Here. This is the concluding verse of this entire section. This is as God commanded Moses on Mount Sinai. The day he commanded what? How to offer their sacrifices. Now here's the story of the initiation. God told Moshe Rabbeinu, get Aaron, get his sons, get the priestly vestments, the very special sacrifices for this event. Let's do it. So Moshe Rabbeinu did what? Over here, as God commanded him to do. And then Moshe Rabbeinu called everybody and told them, this is the matter that God has commanded us to do. Okay? Interesting. He has to tell everybody. And he continues. We're told about how Moshe Rabbeinu dressed up Aaron and his sons, exactly as God commanded Moses. It sounds like the Kudei. It sounds like the Kudei over here. He put on their special hats, just as God commanded Moses. Over here again, he made these sacrifices, just as God commanded Moses. And over here, offer these sacrifices, just as, someone tell me, God commanded Moses. That's about matzahs. And over here, Moshe Rabbeinu took his portion of the sacrifices to eat, because God told him to, just as God commanded Moses. And over here, Moshe Rabbeinu's concluding, telling his brother and his nephews, do exactly as I have commanded you to do. And just as was commanded that they did that day, that's what God commanded them to do for their atonement. And Moshe Rabbeinu says, as I was commanded, see, do this as I was commanded, and it ends with, Once again, sort of the chorus, Asher Tziva Hashem B'Yad Moshe. Slightly different. Okay? That's how we ended up with Tzav. Tzav concludes with the 7 days that Aaron and his sons had to stay in the courtyard of the new tent of meeting. Machlokas Rishonim. Were those 7 days that they start in Adar and culminate on the 8th day, Parashat Shmini? According to a lot of traditions, it was Rosh Chodesh Nisan. So Barbanel has an obvious difficulty with this. I think Ibn Ezra also, maybe I'm mistaken, I'm getting confused. They said, no, this whole thing started on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and the 8th day was the 8th of Nisan. That's not the majority opinion, and that's not what the sages were assuming. By the way, it came the 8th day, now Aaron's actually going to become the priest, and he's going to offer the sacrifice. So let's look for the critical word over here. Look at this. It's going to continue. What happens? They did as they took what Moshe Rabbeinu told them. They got their special animals for this event, and just as Moshe told them to. And Moshe Rabbeinu starts today's service with Moses told them, this is the thing God commanded us to do, and God's glory will appear to you. Wow. So they started. Kasher Tziva Hashem. And over here, they offered this group of sacrifices, basically the entrails from the sin offering, and they did that just as God commanded Moses. Well, it's almost a pattern here. We've seen this 4 times already. Over here, they did the ceremonial waving of the sacrificial parts, just as God commanded, right? Whereas Moses commanded them. And then suddenly something goes wrong. What went wrong? Nadav and Avihu decide to do something that God had not commanded. If I had read through the end of Shemos and the entire beginning of Vayikra in one sitting, I suddenly get to this verse that Nadav and Avihu offered something that they had not been commanded to do. So that's like, scratching the record. Makes a big screech and the music stops and totally silence. In context, that was exactly what they did wrong. And by the way, the record analogy is more apt, especially in this case. You know why? Look at the trouble over here. What is this? It's a mercha chefula, a double mercha. What is the tune of a mercha chefula? Well, what's its function? Normally you have a tipcha, is the stop over here. Tipcha is a mishares, mercha. It only gets one mishares, usually speaking. Before that, the previous stop is a tavir. Okay? And tavir itself has a few misharethim. It could have a whole load of misharethim before it. Even though, basically, the lower level the stop, the more misharethim it could have. Isn't that strange? Yeah. That means the highest level stops, the emperors, the etnach and the siluk, can only have one mishares. Zakef, which is the next level one, could have up to 2 or 3 misharsim. Very interesting. So when tipcha is supposed to have 2 misharsim, the exceptional 2, you get a mercha kfula and a darga. That's what you have over here. Tipcha with 2 misharsim. In Sifrei Emes, you could have the equivalent of the tipcha or its replacement with many more misharsim, and that's beyond the scope of many shurim. But over here, that's what it's doing. You should read this as Asher lo tziwa otham. The tune of the mercha kfula, I can't do it, my throat's hurting, is basically off key. Okay? If you were playing the piano, or playing any other instrument, and just the piano is the one I know. So imagine you're playing a whole tune, well-known tune, and you just press the key that's right next to the one you were supposed to press. It sounds wrong, especially for a tune you know. That's like off key for a second. One wrong note. The mercha kfula, when laned properly, does not fit. It's the wrong note in this context. If I were reading something like here, it said darga, tivir, tipcha, siluk. That sounds right. There it says darga, mercha kfula, siva, utham. It sounds wrong. And if people are listening and you have a good reader, it'll actually get people's attention that there's something wrong going on here. Okay? Something is off key. Similarly, you have a mercha chefula at the point where people say it would have been better, halo tov lanu shuv mitzrayma. Tov, halo tov lanu shuv mitzrayma. Tov sounds wrong. It's off key. Okay? It's the wrong note in that context. It would have been better for us to go to Egypt. They must have been choking as they said it. How could you even utter such a thing? Okay? Anything's Better to go to Egypt, better to go back to Auschwitz than to go to Eretz Yisrael. By the way, that was the situation during the Intifada in, I think it was 2002. The whole March of Living People basically canceled the Israeli leg of the journey. They took American high schoolers, Jewish high schoolers, to Poland, but not to Israel. And the critics pointed out, so now you're declaring that it's safer for a Jew to go to Auschwitz than it is to go to Jerusalem. Big clap. Okay? But that's basically what they were saying. Ridiculous. So here we have it. So Nadav Avihu suddenly did something wrong. And that's why, subsequently, we're not going to have again this refrain as God commanded Moses or as God commanded. Instead, Moshe Rabbeinu is going to take charge. Moshe Rabbeinu is going to have to suddenly use his knowledge of halacha, of the new Torah, to find two cousins to deal with Nadav and Avihu who have passed away, even though Lidoros, the halacha is, let's say a Kohen dies in a building, it's his own immediate relatives, including his father and his brothers, who have to deal with the mace and bury him. Even if there's someone else or someone else's to take care of these particular deceased individuals or individual, the Kohanim are obligated to contaminate themselves, except the Kohen Gadol. Okay? So, according to the halacha that Moshe Rabbeinu was teaching Am Yisrael, it would have been better, it would have been proper, obligatory for Elazar and Ithamar to take care of Nadav and Avihu. And if they needed help, they could get help. But most importantly, they would have to do it. Aaron maybe was already not qualified to do it because maybe he was officially Kohen Gadol now. Okay? When does he actually become Kohen Gadol? I think maybe you can argue that, yes, he's already Kohen Gadol, so now he's exempt. And he may not do so. But either way, Moshe Rabbeinu has to think quickly and halachically at this point. And we'll see there were halachic mistakes made. Moshe Rabbeinu is going to forget halacha. He's going to criticize Elazar and Ithamar about doing something wrong necessarily. Aaron's going to argue against it. Right? It's a long sugya and shas about this. But Moshe Rabbeinu is going to tell them to do as I say, less about God. Kasher diber Moshe, that's what we have over here. And Elazar and Isamar, what did they do? As Kasu Kidvar Moshe, not as God commanded, but as Moshe Rabbeinu commanded. And also over here. We have the mitzvah over here. Aaron was told, no drinking. Kohanim can't drink. Especially when Kohanim want to render psak. No drinking. And that applies even to any chacham. Chacham wants to render an opinion. He shouldn't be shikr, right? And why? Asher diber Hashem Alehem biyad Moshe. Now it's about Moshe Rabbeinu. What happened was this. Many people claim to know what God wants of them. So it's easy. When you have a Navi, you know exactly. When you have Moshe Rabbeinu, you know exactly as it was. Nadav and Avihu, according to the sages, made the mistake. Perhaps, like I said, years past, if any of us had made the mistake, it would have been fine. It wouldn't have been considered a mistake, but they were highest level, so they have much higher standards. Their mistake was thinking that they could give a ruling or decide halacha even on their own, even though Moshe Rabbeinu was there. Why? They say, we know what God wants. God wants us to bring this incense on this alien fire. And that's not the case. They were wrong. That's not what God wanted. And therefore, from now on, once the Torah is in Moshe Rabbeinu's hands, what they need to do is just listen to Moshe Rabbeinu, whoever is the sage then. Don't try to decide, well, I understand what God wanted. Okay, lo b'shamayim he anymore. Now it's in the hands of Moshe Rabbeinu, the halachic authority, not Moshe Rabbeinu the Navi. There's a big nafkamina. The Rambam tells you about that. Moshe Rabbeinu said things in God's name. This is part of the Torah. That's it. It's Moshe Misinai. But Gezeros that Moshe Rabbeinu would make, he needs a beis din to do. Okay? That which was added on. Okay? Harchakos, Hasu Mishmeres Nishmarti. So that's what's happening here. Nadav Avihu made the mistake that they knew perhaps better than what God had wanted, and they were wrong. And from now on, you do as Moshe Rabbeinu says. If you didn't hear from Moshe, you can't assume it came from God. And that's the mistake of Nadav Avihu within the context, the textual context of the Torah over here.